Thanks, Kyle. Sorry, I just see something popped up in the chat. Anyway, okay, so we'll hear from Athena in just a minute. Athena is the Managing Director and Principal of Workplace Law. Athena and her team at Workplace Law provide expert advice for employers in all areas of workplace relations, employment law, industrial disputes, discrimination law, and work health safety. Athena enjoys working across the full range of matters cropping up in these areas of law, whether litigated or non-litigated. Athena has an unflappable sense of humour and a pragmatic approach to guiding and supporting her clients. Thank you so much for joining us, Athena. This is at least your second event with Recovery Partners, so welcome back. We're big fans of yours and we're glad that you agreed to speak again. So I'll hand over to you now, Athena, to discuss the differences in WA legislation and model legislation.
Thanks, Liz, for those very kind words, and thank you for having me again. I always enjoy changes in law, which is probably just, part of the problem with lawyers is that we like changes, even though they bring a lot of disruption, particularly a significant change like this to your business and your enterprise there in Western Australia. So let's try and unpick a lot of the complexity for you. I'm sort of hoping that many of you might actually be national employers with branches in Western Australia. So you may already have some familiarity with the model harmonised work health safety laws. But if not, then I'm going to point out a few of the key differences between the new Work Health Safety Act and the old OSH Act, and just also talk about a couple of the differences in WA compared to the harmonised laws generally that were pushed out as the harmonised package. So today we're going to cover those things. You can see there on the slide, the new Work Health Safety Framework. It is under the umbrella of the Work Health Safety Act, which is a nice clear name now. We're going to look at those differences, and we're going to also just spend a moment on WorkSafe West Australia's enforcement approach. So Kyle, if I could have the next slide, that would be amazing. So the Work Health Safety Act, as you can see there, has been enacted. It actually commenced on the 31st of March this year. And while West Australia has adopted many parts of the Model Act, this is quite a significant change from the OHS Act, as I mentioned earlier. So you can see here that this framework is actually quite useful now with the general regulations, the mine regulations, and the petroleum and geothermal energy operations, all sitting in under the Work Health Safety Act. There are obviously regulations for each industry, and there are general regulations too, which is where all the devil sits in the detail of obligations for those particular industries. But now we have the Umbrella Act, which is the single point of reference, the Work Health Safety Act 2020, even though it was enacted in 2022. Just onto the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the most significant changes at this point. So the harmonised Work Health Safety Act is intended to broaden the scope of responsibilities for employers and anybody else who engages workers in Western Australia. So as you will all know, the duties under the OSHA were drafted based on the traditional employee-employer relationships, which we all know now are significantly more complicated. We have a gig economy, we have, labour hire, we have contractors with subcontractors, with subcontractors, and some of those relationships fell through the cracks in terms of, the person responsible was not necessarily, going to put time, energy, and effort into ensuring that a subcontractor was responsible for work health safety arrangements for those people. So the Work Health Safety Act it has broad concepts which intend to cover the new employment model, and those include the key concepts of persons conducting a business or undertaking, which we know as a PCBU, and workers instead of employers and employees. There's a non-exhaustive definition of a PCBU in Section 5, and it says that includes partnerships, associations, all other kinds of organisations that engage people to do work for them. And I find it useful that, as a rule of thumb, you think about a PCBU as anyone for whom work is being performed. So if you have someone, regardless of what sort of shape, size, kind of entity you are, then you can assume that you have a work health safety obligation now to the people who are performing work for you. A worker also has an expanded definition in Section 7. It includes employees, contractors, subcontractors, and the employees of the subcontractors, labour hire workers, outworkers, apprentices, trainees, work experience students, and volunteers. So that is a massively expanded definition to what we had before, which was employees. And obviously in 2005, there were some amendments that captured contract work and labour hire arrangements, but this expands on that yet again. The key obligation under the new Work Health Safety Act is to require the PCBU to ensure, as far as reasonably practicable, which are great words, that workers working for the PCBU are not exposed to health and safety risks. And obviously the expanded definitions of PCBU and worker mean that obligation is massively expanded compared to what was under the previous legislation. So the worker is now owed that duty if they're engaged or caused to be engaged by a PCBU, or if their activities in carrying out work are influenced or directed by a PCBU. So it could even be a tangential relationship, whereas somebody might be working for a subcontractor, but there's, you know, a site manager who's employed by somebody else who has some sort of influence over the way that they carry out their work. And we'll talk about consultation in a minute and explain that this is supposed to be a collaborative effort between all of the people involved in a work on a particular location or a site. So the OSHA required employers to consult with employees and HSRs, and that was pretty clear. We're all pretty used to that. That was fine. But now, because of this expanded definition of worker, consultation is required with the workers who carry out work for the PCBU and who are likely to be directly affected by a work health safety matter. Obligation to consult is, again, as far as is reasonably practicable, which is nice. It gives you some wiggle room there in terms of what reasonably practicable is. And importantly, it's worth noting the provisions of Section 46, where if you've got one PCBU having a duty, that obligation in relation to consultation, where there are multiple PCBUs at a multiple PCBU site, there's an obligation to consult, cooperate, and coordinate activities with each other. So if you know you're a subcontractor on a site and you're doing tiling, and somebody else is a subcontractor on the site and pouring concrete, and somebody else is painting, then all of you together under hopefully some sort of organisation from the head contractor should be engaging in consultation with all workers on the site in relation to work health safety matters. There's a specific officer's due diligence obligation, and certainly when this legislation was rolled out in other jurisdictions, this is one of the things that caused the most concern. So while there was not a positive obligation imposed on officers under the OSHA, the Work Health Safety Act actually sets out specific duties for officers in Section 27. I personally think this is actually helpful, because rather than having the old standard, which allowed officers to be held liable for the offences committed by the body corporate, which was sort of an open-ended question in some respects, because you may not, as an officer, know what somebody else is doing in another location. Now you have very clear duties and obligations with which you must comply. And those are duties and obligations that are clearly serious. They're in the Act. There's no negotiation about them. You must comply with them. So I'd encourage, one of the things that fell out of other jurisdictions where this was introduced was there was a massive influx of training requests for officers of organisations, because I think as an employer or as a PCBU in this case, you must make sure that all of your people who are deemed to be officers under this legislation should be properly trained in what their obligations are. So please make sure that your officers understand the standard of care that's expected from them, and that you've done your bit by helping educate them by training them properly. There's an interesting obligation which is different to all of the other states that have introduced the harmonised legislation in WA, and that's about work health safety service providers. So Section 26A imposes a duty on PCBUs that provide work health safety services, and the guidance material says that that's not necessarily general advice or training would not be really considered to be a work health safety service, but it's something that is specifically provided to a PCBU and tailored to the circumstances of a workplace. When thinking about this, I'm thinking about, okay, you've engaged someone to come in and implement, a safety lockout system on your equipment. That might be something that would fall under this. So if you are a provider of safety services in WA, then take note that you have an obligation under the Western Australian legislation that you don't necessarily have anywhere else in Australia under the harmonised rules. Just harking back to what Simon mentioned earlier about industrial manslaughter, this is a significant departure from the OSHA, and a similar offence didn't exist under the OSHA. The industrial manslaughter offence appears in section 30A if you want to have a look at it. And under that section, a PCBU or an officer may commit industrial manslaughter if they engage in conduct that causes the death of an individual. The conduct constitutes a failure to comply with a health safety duty, including your duties as officers, which is very important why officers know what they are. That they engage in conduct knowing that the conduct is likely to cause death or serious harm, regardless of the probability or the likelihood of that. And in the case of an officer, the conduct is attributable to neglect and is within the officer's consent or connivance. That's a good legal word, but obviously if the officer knew about it or should have known about it is what they mean there. This is a whacking great big penalty situation here. The offence is punishable by 20 years imprisonment and a $5 million fine for individuals. And bodies corporate, because obviously you can't send a body corporate to jail, you can only send officers to jail, but the body corporates face a $10 million fine. So I might just say that again, 20 years imprisonment, $5 million fine for individual people, and body's corporate face up to a $10 million fine for industrial manslaughter. And if that's not enough to motivate people to, update their processes and systems, then I'm not really quite sure what is. Just moving on to the next slide, we'll just talk about a couple of the differences between the Western Australian legislation and the model legislation. I've talked about a couple of them already. I'll just mention changes to Category 1. The Western Australian Act omits the fault of recklessness for Category 1 and incorporates an element of causation, which is slightly different to the other harmonised standard laws. So a person who fails to comply with a health and safety duty causing death or serious harm to an individual is guilty of a Category 1 offence in Western Australia. This penalty, not quite as awful as industrial manslaughter, but still pretty awful. 5 years imprisonment, $340,000 for individuals and other individual people, PCBUs and officers. 5 years imprisonment, $680,000 for PCBUs and officers, and $3.5 million for body corporates are the maximum penalties there. The other thing that's a change is the prohibition on insurance. So there is a prohibition in section 272 A prohibiting insurance and indemnity for monetary penalties imposed under the West Australian Act. So if you have your standard insurance package, it's worth checking this just to make sure that you don't inadvertently now have insurance covering or any sort of arrangement indemnifying your organisation in relation to monetary penalties that could be imposed under the Work Health Safety Act. There's a pretty significant penalty. It's $51,000 for having this prohibited insurance. So, and $255,000 for bodies corporate who have this prohibited insurance. So it's just worth checking with your policy or your broker to make sure you don't have it anymore. That is worth getting rid of just to avoid the penalty. Moving over to the next slide, I just want to talk about right of entry. Right of entry is specifically covered in the harmonised legislation, but Western Australia have decided to keep their right of entry provisions in the Industrial Relations Act. So there's a very significant omission there in terms of right of entry. I thought I'd just pick a couple of other interesting things. There's some new anti-smoking provisions in the work health safety legislation now. In the regulations, you can have a look at Regulation 50D, which provides that a person must not smoke in an enclosed workspace, and further, a PCBU must not allow a person to smoke in the workplace. And there's some nice penalties associated with that. And I'll just mention demolition work because there's a whole part now, part 4.6, which is dedicated to the requirements for demolition work. So those are the key differences. And just moving to the next slide, I'm just going to mention the enforcement approach that WorkSafe WA is going to take. And this seems to mirror the enforcement provisions that applied when this harmonised legislation was rolled out in other jurisdictions, which is that there's sort of no intention really to come out with the big sticks and start whacking people with prosecutions in at least the first 12 months. It's certainly in New South Wales and the other East Coast jurisdictions, there was a very significant education effort made to make sure that employers and other people engaging workers in these jurisdictions were educated, well armed. There was no excuse for anybody to say that they didn't know. They'd had plenty of opportunity to train their officers and all of those other sort of things before the prosecution stick started coming out. So take this grace period for what it is, which is your opportunity to get your systems and processes up to speed, and your training and other provisions that you need to update as a result of these changes rolled out. I just want to talk about, on the next slide, a couple of changes in relation to prosecutions when we get to there. So just over on the next slide, Kyle, when you're ready. Oh, thank you. Sorry, that was me, not Kyle. So work health safety undertakings, the new Act actually makes better provision for work health safety undertakings than the old regime did. And this is an enforcement tool that can now be pursued as an alternative to prosecution in certain circumstances. Under the OSHA, as I'm sure you all know, employers were able to enter into an undertaking, but only after the employer had been convicted and fined. And if the court made an order allowing the undertaking to take place, which sort of seems counterintuitive. I mean, this now provides a nice clear path, which is negotiate your undertaking if you can, versus being prosecuted and incurring all those court costs and stress and anxiety and other things that go along with litigation. So under section 216, that's where the power sits to accept enforceable undertakings. The court's permission is no longer required. Undertakings cannot be used in industrial manslaughter and category 1 offences, I think for probably obvious reasons. The other thing I'm just going to mention is non-disturbance notices. So the Work Health Safety Act will include non-disturbance notices in Western Australia, and those did not exist under the OSHA. So for people at the ground level who may have incidents in the workplace and be responsible for managing them, please take note, because this is a serious one. And those non-disturbance notices can be issued by an inspector if they think that they need to do it in order to exercise their compliance powers. And it's a pretty regular occurrence in most of the other states that have harmonised legislation. It's pretty much the equivalent of police tape around the site while everybody does their investigation and before the site is released to continue on. So you may have to preserve the incident site, you may have to prevent the disturbance of the site, and it may be for a reasonably long period. So be prepared that this could be a very disruptive piece of legislative requirement for your operation. If, for example, there was an incident in your driveway and the whole driveway was subject to a non-disturbance notice, that could obviously cause some impediment if the driveway is the only way in or out. But just be prepared that these things might, and indeed I think will, happen now. The notice clearly does not prevent any action to assist an injured person or remove, in the worst case, a deceased person. So please don't feel that you have to stand there and go, oh, I can't touch you because of a disturbance notice. Please help people. That's still allowed. And obviously you can assist with a police investigation, which is sometimes runs parallel with these sort of things. I'll just briefly mention limitations periods. Under the OSHA, offences, prosecutions could be brought within 3 years of the offence being committed. There's sort of a cascading range of different limitations periods now. Note that there is no limitation period for industrial manslaughter. They're treating it as a crime, like a crime of manslaughter, and there are no limitation periods for those kind of offences. But otherwise, the limitation period for work health safety offences is 2 years after the offence first comes to the notice of the regulator. So that's sort of, I guess, a little bit better. It's better than hanging around for 3. Or 1 year after a coronial report is made or the coronial inquiry or inquest ends, or 6 months after a work health safety undertaking is contravened. If you make an undertaking, please don't contravene it. You'll wind up with a prosecution. Proceedings for Category 1, I will just mention, could be brought after the limitation period is expired if new information comes to light that a court determines was not reasonably available at the time within the limitation period. So you're not necessarily, done and dusted after the limitation period for Category 1 offences. If there is new material floating around out there that may come to the regulator's attention. Those are the only things I wanted to say. I'm sorry I went a bit longer than I said that I would, Liz. And I'll just briefly shout out workplace laws, well, particularly female, but generally everybody champions program, which are sporting organisations that we support. And if you want to champion a female athlete or a female sporting organisation, please reach out and we will help you do it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Athena. That was brilliant. And yeah, as we all know, there has been a lot of focus on the industrial manslaughter changes, and for good reason. But it was great to get a broader understanding of all the changes from terms like workers to WA's enforcement approach and everything else you spoke to. So thank you so much. If anyone does have any questions for Athena, you can pop these in the chat and we'll have a chance to discuss these in the Q&A a bit later. I noticed there has been one question already, so that's great. We'll move on to Chi now. So we're very lucky to have Chi as the General Manager of Safety at Recovery Partners. Chi has been in the safety and injury management sector for over 15 years. He is a hands-on leader, having completed a Masters of OHS. Chi is client-focused and can think outside the box. He provides solutions that are practical, realistic, and align with operational demands. As a safety specialist, Chi will ensure you know how to implement the model work health safety laws in Western Australia to keep your people and your business safe. Chi, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Liz. And yeah, big thanks to Athena for the informative information that she's provided today. So my part of the presentation will be more focused on how to successfully transition from the old system to the new sets of laws. Okay, so again, my information will be a little bit more what should we do, what does this sort of mean in terms of changes for your business, and how can we best put some action into place to ensure that you do remain compliant and reduce risk as much as possible there. My first couple of slides will, however, flow on from Athena's, which is essentially to talk about some of those changes. So just to break down some of those key changes there. So Athena provided some information around the relationship of workers or the employee and employer to obviously broaden to cover a wider range of people that actually do work or conduct work. So I've just provided a bit of a snapshot on what some of the old and new things have come into place to try and help provide a little bit more understanding. So I might actually move into the next slide, if that's okay, Kyle. Look, Athena did mention some penalties. So again, I think it's a really, really important part of the transition to be aware of. Again, Athena did mention if it doesn't get you motivated to do the right thing and comply, yeah, there's the hefty changes and significant increases in penalties may get you thinking twice here. So again, I won't run through each of those in detail, but the table provides a simple differential in terms of what the old and new penalties look like. So certainly there is a lot of continued focus on officers of organisations to ensure that they're doing their part, and a lot of that is around exercising and showing their positive due diligence is executed throughout their organisation. Kyle, get you to move into the next one. Thank you. So yep, 27, section 27. So that's basically the officers. I'm mindful that there are many different people in the audience today. I won't particularly focus on officers, but there is a fair bit of focus to ensure that, again, people with control over organisations that have significant contributions to decision-making processes do have a fair bit of obligation to ensure what is done within reason is actually being done there. Kyle, next. So whilst we are talking about officers, positive due diligence and exercising that, these are the components that we really need to be ensuring that when we say, have you exercised your due diligence as an officer? These are the key components that we want to be aware of there. So the first box there basically states some of the things that we want to include. So acquiring information. Firstly, attending today, that's a good start. You're acquiring information in relation to the transition around the WHS Act into Western Australia now. But it doesn't just stop there. It's about ensuring that you're acquiring information on an ongoing basis. So whether there are more changes to come or any other regulations that might relate to your organisation and any other bits of information from the regulator are actually, you're acquiring that information there. Gaining an understanding of operation. So again, you may, as an officer, having a big part of the organisation in making it run, we need to make sure that you're fully aware of the operation. And in a safety context, understanding your risk profile is the first point, is what we always suggest for officers. And really that means, do you understand the risks that are associated with the works that your organisation and your people within your organisation actually are exposed to? And again, not just understanding what that is, but what are we doing about it to ensure that we're continuing to try and reduce risk as much as practical. Third point there is ensuring sufficient resources. So that's ensuring that, again, depending on your risk profile of your organisation and your structure, making sure that you've got the right people in the right role to ensure that, again, we're managing risk efficiently. So it's, I guess an example is if you're in a higher risk profile, whether it's, infrastructure construction, and we're sort of working in high risk type of work, we want to ensure that we have dedicated specialists that are engaged to our organisation to make sure that we have the right information to, again, continuously tackle and reduce risk as much as possible. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to engage someone externally. That's obviously an option as well. But ensuring that you've got an in-house a WHS officer or an advisor is obviously a good consideration to have there. Second last one there was ensure the appropriate risk identification process, making sure that you actually have a process in place. So it sort of tails onto the next point around the system, knowledge and systems. So we've got to ensure that our system that we have in place, that's basically the nuts and bolts to that state, how we are going to manage risk within an organisation, is actually defined and practical, okay? And ensuring implementation of that system, okay? We can't just ensure that, we can go off and grab a new system that's aligned to the most recent ISO 45001 standard, grab it off the shelf and store it there to ensure that, yep, I've ticked the box there. We've got to make sure it's implemented. There are various elements that we need to consider as part of the implementation process. Like any change management within any organisation, consultation is going to be a real key part of that. So ensuring that the key people or persons within the organisation are consulted. That information is obviously shared upon the organisation to ensure that everyone is fully aware and understands what the system is and how it's actually how it's correctly to be used. So I'll move into the knowledge and systems. So we've stated here, systems adapted to benchmark within supported training and knowledge. So again, we've got a new system in place. We've got to make sure that's been shared upon within the organisation, whether it be trainings or various workshops within your organisation. So we've got our system in place. We've made sure that everyone's consulted and trained on how to effectively use the system. We want to make sure that it's now, we monitor and we ensure that what is actually being intended to be done is actually done in the right way. And so there are some key things that we can do as part of that. Again, whether you have an external or internal resource that looks after your work health and safety management system, that we are tracking some of our key performance indicators in relation to workplace safety. So some of these things can be, leading and lagging indicators. Leading indicators can be how we positively trying to reduce risk as much as possible. So that's hazard identification. How many hazard reports have we done? What are some of the compliance activities related to our management systems? So it can be, are we doing our workplace inspections? Are we doing our toolbox talks? How many safe work method statements have we started to ensure that we are checking off and ensuring the quality is actually correct in the content there? And the last one there is actually is enabling reasonable action for any of these processes. So again, identification, implementation, rolling it out, and ensuring that it's all correct. And the key part of that is quality, to ensure that what is done is actually being done correct and for its intended purpose there. Next one there, Kyle. So where to from here? Again, understanding the changes is the most obvious one. As Athena mentioned, it's in effect, the WHS Act for 2020 is in effect for the Western Australian jurisdiction as of March. So if you're not aware of it, hopefully you are now. Know your role. So we mentioned, again, what's the requirement for officers under due diligence. But it's not just that, it's me, even as a service provider, we've got obligations and we've got to make sure that what the advice that we provide is sound and correct, and it's not putting anyone at immediate risk of seriously injuring themselves there. So anyone running an organisation, officers, myself as a service provider, it can even be workers. There's a lot more clarity on what's required as a person that actually does the work. So individuals can be fined now. So we now know that, and it's really important that this information be passed. So training, consultation is a really key part of that. Second one there is demonstrate your due diligence. So my previous slide again states some of the key things that we need to consider, but how do we actually demonstrate that we're actually doing that? Auditing is a really good start. So again, with some key changes that are applicable to the Western Australian jurisdiction, we need to make sure that whatever we have had in place is actually aligning to the standard, but also the new act that's come into place. So first is a good point is to conduct an internal audit to reduce or eliminate any bias that's affiliated with any internal type of activities. There is the option to engage an external provider to come in and again audit you against the Act and the most relevant standard being the ISO 45001 standard there. Second one there is KPIs for leadership. We mentioned some of the positive performance indicators. Some of these things can actually flow on into what are we trying to achieve out of our system for everyone within the organisation, but more so, what are our leaders having to do, rather than just ensure that we've got systems in place, we've got the right people in the right roles. Well, what is our senior leadership team doing? What are our officers actually doing? So enabling KPIs to align with your system, whether that be conducting floor walks, conducting some toolbox talks themselves, can be doing some safe work observations. Tools like this that we build into our system, and again assigning to some of our senior leaders, is a really good way that we can show senior leadership involvement. And if you haven't already been exposed to the new ISO standard 45001, a lot of that is leadership heavy in terms of what is required. So yeah, it's a good consideration to have there. The third point there that I've got is capturing and reporting the lead and positive indicators. It's far too often that across most organisations that aren't really up to speed with the modern approach within workplace safety. They're continuing to focus on lagging indicators. So these are your lost time injury frequency rates, those types of things. We want to get positive in regards to what are our positive performance indicators, what are our leading indicators. So again, like I've mentioned to you, what are some of the things that we can measure against our system, ensure that our system is working and it is correct and it's doing its job as intended. So having a look at that as well. And the last point there is walking the walk. I know it's very, very basic and broad, but I can't stress it enough. People can, state what their vision is and what their intention is. for their organisation. But if we're not walking the walk, and that's across all levels of structures, whether it's top leadership versus people working on the floor, we've got to make sure that everyone is actually singing the same song, and that's about being consistent and getting it right, getting it right and treating it, giving it the respect it deserves, because everyone has that obligation to essentially go to work and come home in the same way, maybe a little bit tighter, but in terms of their safety and well-being, that's obviously maintained as best as possible. Third point there, and I will finish off on that, is around reviewing your non-direct employee safety processes. Another word for this is your contractor management. Again, the Act has really focused on this change on how the modern day approach and the modern day of how work is actually conducted. It's no longer just around the employer and employee relationship. There's so many different structures we have in place, and contracting is a massive area that how we get actual work done within our businesses. So contractor management, have a look at who you engage to do the work, both employees and non-employees. So contractors, labour hire, like what Athena's mentioned before, subcontractors. So making sure you've got some really good, robust processes as part of your system to ensure that you're obtaining and you're overseeing how work is actually being conducted by your contractors there is really, really important. There are lots of different systems to host your core management system, but also your contractor management system. And paperless system, cloud-based systems are becoming a really, really popular option, for a very, very good reason, because it makes things more efficient. It enables us to capture and oversee any of these processes that are actually being done and being done correctly. So yeah, that's that. Look, a few key tips. Again, we've seen management systems that are really simple, that work really well, and that hits the mark in terms of managing risks within your organization. But keep it simple. You don't have to put something in place that is, it's got you've got 20 different policies, and then you've got 50 different procedures. It may be, if your business is quite diverse and complex, that you might have a very large system. If that's the way it is, and it is. But for the most part, that doesn't need to be overly complicated, because sometimes it doesn't really necessarily show that it actually works in the intended way. Keep it simple. Integrate your activities. Achieve buy-in from workers. There's nothing worse than implementing any new system or process in place and workers getting disgruntled about, oh, it doesn't work. We don't believe in it. You're not going to get that buy-in and overall compliance out of it. Doesn't necessarily hit the mark there. Ensure the effective reporting. So again, have a look at how you're doing reporting. And I'd highly suggest, if you don't use an online hosted system, there are many out there. Have a look at those, because they can be really, really effective in terms of being able to access information. So dashboards and things like that can be really, really good to be able to help monitor that. And the last one there, we've got ensure the action and implementation is being executed in the correct manner.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chi. Yeah, safety definitely isn't just a checkbox. It's about implementation and using those positive lead indicators. Thank you so much to both our speakers today, and equally to our audience for tuning in and acquiring information. We hope you've found today helpful so far. We'll get to questions in just a minute. I've seen there's a few come through. We wanted to quickly let you know that Recovery Partners offer a range of safety services, including safety training to help your business run safely and conscientiously. You might also be interested in our latest Safety Innovation Complete Compliance, which you can see there now. This helps you manage both your WHS and return to work legal obligations using our skill set, and it's aimed at small to medium businesses. We also have a range of other compliance assistance programs, like our Safety Partnership Program or WHSMS audits. If you're interested in any of these or any additional information about the changes to the laws, you can get in touch with Simon Lloyd, our Director of Safety Services. So his details are up on the screen there. And yes, online training is an option, as someone asked about that and she's just responded. Cool, so we'll go to our questions now. I'll start from the top. So someone earlier on, Athena, when you were speaking, and this is definitely a question, a sign of the times, does the smoking provision extend to vaping?
That is a good question. And I was just trying to fossick through that regulation to find it again. I did see when I was looking at it yesterday that there is a definition of tobacco product. So I'm not sure that it does extend to vaping, but in terms of harmful substances being in the air, like whether it's tobacco smoke or it's other smoke that contains nicotine sort of leftovers from being in somebody else's lungs, you'd want to be very careful about whether or not you made that distinction in your workplace. This question has actually come up a lot, and I think actually there's been some jurisdictions that have banned vaping now, so it's actually quite difficult to get your vaping stuff in some of the Australian jurisdictions now. So I'm not quite sure if it's here to stay, but yeah, do think carefully before you say vaping's cool and smoking isn't, if that was something that you were thinking about for your workplace.
And keeping on theme with that, someone has asked, is it correct that the previous OSH laws covered tobacco smoke, but the new laws now include requirements of secondhand smoke? No, covered that just then.
Yes, secondhand smoking has got its own provisions there. So if you start at that, if you wanted to have a look for yourselves, if you start at that, I think it was regulation 50D, there's a section there, I think it's DEFG or something like that. It does actually finish off with a secondhand smoke obligation. So yes, very tightly covered and specifically dealt with in the new regulation.
Thank you. All right, next question. With the new Act, is it correct that prosecutors do not have to conduct the company to then be able to convict company officers? But that was the case in the old prosecution type under WA's gross negligence law.
Yes, that is true. And what happens now is that companies will be prosecuted for company breaches. Under the OSHA, officers were sort of deemed to have committed the same offence as the company. Now no longer the case. So while there are specific obligations on officers, in some respects, as I mentioned earlier, it's actually a good thing, because prosecution will be for an officer breaching their duties as they are set out in section 27, which Chi described in a lot more detail and far more comprehensively than me. So yeah, please note that just because a company is prosecuted doesn't mean an officer will be. Traditionally they are, but they will be prosecuted for a breach of their duty as an officer, rather, or you know, one of the industrial manslaughter obligations, rather than you know, necessarily being deemed to have committed the same offence as the company.
Great, thank you. I've got a question for Chi. What training is available specific to duties of officers? Specifically, if your company is remote, is online training available?
Yeah, definitely. There is officer training, so officer due diligence training that is specifically focused on WHS due diligence. So there is the option of having some face-to-face training. It can be done online, and it can be done via a senior safety facilitator or trainer. And I know that what we do here at Recovery Partners, we also have the option of having it co-facilitated with a legal expert as well, like Athena. So yeah, you can have the option, again, someone that's obviously quite cluey and has that training available. So face-to-face, online, definitely there's plenty of ways in which we can roll that training out.
Okay, thanks, Chi. This one's specifically for Athena. From Philip, hello Athena. In March 2022, Victoria amended its OHS Act to expand duties to labour hire workers, consultation focused. Do you know if the WA changes are covering this area?
Hi Philip, and look, the definition of worker in Section 7 of the Western Australian Work Health Safety Act includes labour hire workers. So that expanded definition of worker, including labour hire workers, now flows through, including to consultation obligations. And as I mentioned earlier, it's also the obligation of multiple PCBUs working in one sort of function or facility or site to collaborate together in relation to consultation. So I think these Western Australian provisions cover labour hire pretty comprehensively.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, I'll do one last question. There seems to be a sneaky new requirement in the regulations around earth-moving machinery, where it's used for crane-type operations. Regulations relating to high-risk work licenses then apply, i.e. crane ticket. Do you know much about this, as it seems to be more of a side note under Reg 5, Reg 81 and Schedule 3? Athena?
Look,
they seem to know their stuff.
I haven't looked at those provisions in any detail yet, but what I will say is we noticed when harmonised Act and updated regulations were rolled out in other jurisdictions, there were some significant, if not very well publicised, changes that popped up in the regs. And I mentioned the demolition one, for example, as being a pretty significant bunch of changes in the regulation, but it could very well be that earth moving and mobile cranes and all of those sort of things are similarly updated and slightly shifted in this regulation. Would not surprise me at all. And I think it would be prudent for employers and PCBUs in Western Australia who have specific focuses that are dealt with under the regulations to just sit down with your hot cup of tea and make sure that you've read and you are across all of that material that's new. And I just saw a comment flash up that there is quite a lot of education material available from the West Australian Safe Work, I think it was mentioned. Dive in there, utilize all of those things, because the devil will be in the detail in the regulations, and you just don't want to get yourself tripped up because you were thinking it was the same as it was before, when indeed it's not.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Athena and Chi. We might finish on that note. The devil is in the detail seems to be a good takeaway message. So if you have any other further questions for Recovery Partners or Chi or Athena, you can email them to myself at elizabeth.t@rrp.com.au, or you can give me a call on that number if you'd like to get in touch with Chi or Athena. I can help you out. And we also invite you to follow us on LinkedIn and social media to see our latest updates, blog articles, news, and upcoming events. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and may the 4th be with you. Thank you. Lovely.